Our guest today is Germaine Greer, writer, academic and broadcaster. She's known as one of the most influential feminist voices of the 20th century. She was born in Melbourne, Australia, and came to this country in 1964 to do her doctorate at Cambridge University. Although she's now retired as a professor of English literature, she's still an energetic campaigner and contributor to the public debate. Germaine, thank you for coming in today. I suppose it's generally thought that our early years, our school education, has a huge influence on the rest of our lives. I found your own schooling and your reaction to it really, really interesting. Could you just briefly outline, those early school days back in Australia? How were you educated? Where were you educated?
I was educated from the age of 3, really. The first school I had was a kindergarten. Then I went to my first primary school, which was Sacred Heart School in Elwood. And I pretended that that was stranger than it was to make it a bit more interesting. I got into trouble for pretending that I thought the nun who was teaching me was a witch. And I said something to the child next to me because there was this person draped from head to foot in black, and I thought, oh, she's a witch. So I got into trouble. I think it was on my very first day. But I loved school. And I've always loved school. And I would have stayed at school all my life if I could. We moved when I was about 8. And we were then in a rougher part of town, another seaside suburb. But this school was more crowded and more messy, and the kids were poorer. And I was taught by nuns who, as I understand it, were not paid. They didn't get any salary at all. They lived in the convent.
It's part of their work.
I went at 12 to a Cramis, which was called Holy Redeemer School, Ripponlea, and that was all financed by the diocese. Yeah. Because the Catholic schools were very aware of the fact that they were under a disadvantage because they didn't get state revenue.
That's right, in Australia they're seen as private schools, the church schools.
And in fact we paid 1 6 a week, I remember, when I went to Sacred Heart. Then I won my diocesan scholarship, and the point of that was to get me to win a government scholarship to pay for my secondary schooling.
I see.
And that was quite funny because that was a statewide competition, and we kids who'd been to this special school where we were taught really hard. We were taught for a good 8 hours a day, and I loved it, of course.
And was that still being taught by nuns once you got the scholarship?
Still a nun, yes.
Yeah. I mean,
but a very good nun, a very energetic, intense teacher who had us, and I think she taught us all day long, I don't seem to
She didn't do anything else apart from teaching you and the work that she did in the church, perhaps. But Germaine, that's one of the things that interests me. I think when I read that was your education, I think, had I not gone on to read what you thought about it, I would have said, that's what made her become a feminist, that's what made her become a rebel. You actually say that's where almost I'd still like to be. Can you capture what it was that's the reason for you being so very, very fond of those early years?
Well, the important thing about it was that we were outsiders. Less outsiders as Catholics in Australia than Catholics are in the United Kingdom, where I think they are really discriminated against. Because we were, a third of the population in those days, and we considered ourselves disadvantaged. We were also profoundly influenced by the Irish, so we were taught to distrust and fear the government. And then, what happened next is I win another scholarship to Star of the Sea Convent Garden Vale, which is where I did my secondary schooling. And the problem there was, for me, that we were miles ahead of them, we scholarship girls. The first couple of years, bored to death. We'd have all the books read on the first day of the first term, and then have to endure other kids, other girls, struggling with things that we found really easy.
What normally happens to children who are in that position, they become a bit of the rebel because they are bored. I mean, given what we know of you in your adult life, you got into trouble the first day at school, but throughout those years, even at secondary school, were you...
In trouble?
Were you in trouble?
Yes.
Frequently. But it didn't stop you learning, did it? You were both in trouble but loved learning.
Well, the thing was...
Did it put you off?
The nuns always used to say that I was completely irrepressible, would say on my report that I took punishment very well.
Yeah.
Because I never resented it, really. It was mainly being just turned out of the class, made to cool your heels in the corridor.
Yeah, and then back in. Yeah.
But I would have preferred they sent me to the library, but that'd be too much like fun.
Yeah, yeah.
So I was forever, when they'd ask a question, when the nuns would ask a question, the hands would go up. I'd know the answer, but they'd never ask me.
Yeah. You obviously knew you were bright then. Were they good at telling you were bright and encouraging you and saying you can make university, you've got choices in life?
Well, they didn't really have to. I mean, I was getting prizes all the time, which is pretty obvious. Not that I'm very keen on all of that. I think that's a bit stupid. It's your job as an educator to make sure that the kid does the best that that child can do, and not to sort of sit around rewarding innate ability. That's a real dereliction of duty, in my view, because I never met a stupid child. I've met lots of children who found it difficult to communicate or who weren't interested in what was being pushed at them. But every child has skills, and some of them are extraordinary. I mean, it's not for nothing now that we know that our most successful people, like Bill Gates and Richard Branson, were bad at school.
Just take it on now. I mean, we know you're an academic. We know you've lectured universities throughout the UK, but it wasn't till I read your background that I realised you'd taught secondary age children as well. So presumably that was your first job after you left university. So what made you go into teaching? Was it something you aspired to do because you'd enjoyed school yourself, or were you a bit of a drifter into
No,
teaching?
I was in a very particular bind, which was that I won 3 scholarships when I finished my secondary schooling. And my parents wouldn't let me take one that didn't have an income attached to it, didn't have an allowance. So I had to take the Teachers College Scholarship because the other scholarships were means tested and we didn't apparently qualify. I enjoyed teaching when I was on my Teachers College Scholarship. The practicals we did were huge fun.
Yes.
And I'd been teaching even when I was at school. I'd been put in charge of a class.
With the younger girls, which is, of course, how people used to learn to teach.
Indeed. And it's always struck me as a wonderful job. But I think everybody should do it. I think it's natural for people to teach other people. And people shouldn't think of it as something that only professionals can do, because in some ways professionals are least gifted at it.
We'll come back to that, because. But what kind of kids did you teach?
The most important teaching I did, the teaching that for me was a watershed in my life, that was after I went to Sydney. And I was already doing, I was repairing damage done to my first degree by doing an MA there. And I was teaching at a junior girls' high school, which was a school for young women from the end of primary school to the middle of secondary school, from their merit
like
to their intermediate.
middle school sort of.
Yes.
Yeah.
They left on their 15th birthday.
Yeah.
Like clockwork. And I was given 2 sorts of children to teach. The A stream, who were the clever little girls, and then I had my E's, who were
Bottom stream.
big, hefty, poor girls mostly, some already working as prostitutes. Often they'd been knocked around at home, which is not in the least unusual. And they were generally regarded as a problem. I was told, just keep them quiet.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't do that, because I think you really must not waste a child's time, ever.
Did you get through to them? Did you make good relationships with them? Do you think you
well,
taught them?
I learned a lesson which is quite important.
Yeah.
I decided to teach them poetry. They had a poetry book that was full of rubbish, jingoistic nonsense. And I decided I would teach them the best English poetry I knew. So I taught them sonnets, Donne's Holy Sonnets, Wordsworth, Keats. And we had a wonderful time in the class because they were actually very quick, these girls. And I pointed out to them that you had different patterns going through the structure. So you had a basic beat. Now someone would tap out the basic beat. Then you had the punctuation beat. So we put that over the top of that. And then you had the actual sound patterning within the lines and so on. So we'd end up with this kind of ragtime version of the sonnet. And if the sonnet was in it was a conversation, or if it was addressed from one person to another. So they act it out, and they get to understand just how amazingly rich and complicated this thing was. And of course, by the time we'd done all that, they could remember them.
Yeah, yeah.
And I thought, yes, yes, there you'll be in the pickle factory. And instead of rubbish going through your head, some of the time, this will go through your head, and it will give you solace. It will give you some feeling of your human dignity in a pretty awful situation. Now, I left that school to become a teacher at Sydney University. And there I was, sitting in my office in Sydney University, and a tap, tap, tap on the door. And into the room come 3 girls in Marrickville Junior Girls High School uniform, clutching flowers that they've nicked from the plantings outside. And they said, Miss, if we behave ourselves, can you come back and teach us poetry again?
That's lovely.
Well, it's not lovely. Because I realised that I'd done something that a young teacher sometimes does. I'd actually exploited my own charisma with these children. And they thought it was me instead of the subject. And that's a tricky thing.
Yes, I know, but you've just said how important teachers are. The sonnets had been around for ages, and you were the person that actually enabled them to appreciate the sonnet. In some ways, if you cut yourself out of that equation, you actually say teachers aren't important in opening young children's minds.
Well, I think I've learnt a different lesson now. I mean, I've been in front of so many different classes, and every time you think, I've got to capture them.
Yeah.
And I find a way to draw you into it.
Yeah.
But I've got to be careful there, I think. Because it's too easy to harvest the kids' adulation, you know, and it's sinister. It gives you excess influence over them.
Yeah.
You've got to be also aware that you want to provoke their opposition.
Yeah.
You want them to get stroppy with you. You want them to disbelieve you as well. You don't want them to believe that everything that falls from your lips is gospel truth.
You had a lovely phrase, actually, that I read. I was going to read it out, because I think people are very interested in this. You said, a truly incompetent teacher can be of more value than a good one. Confusion is the most productive state of mind. I mean, I've spent most of the last 10 years trying to get rid of incompetent teachers and sort of train them in that. I think I know what you mean there, but talk about it a little bit. It's really interesting, this notion that, you know, the way we learn doesn't always need a super duper trained teacher, and you actually say a good teacher could be one that makes you challenge and ask questions rather than
or can be a complete
to achieve
bumbler.
academically.
So you listen to this teacher making a complete mess of something, and you say to yourself, it can't be like that. It's got to be easier than that. You know, Occam's razor. Let's go.
You might have said that because you're bright, and as you say, you're innately bright in the first place. You would probably always have achieved. But think of some of the girls you just spoke about who ended up in the pickle factory. If they were taught all the time by incompetent teachers.
They had been.
Key to success or not?
They had been. No, I don't think. But I think it's important not to overestimate what it is that a teacher does. That a teacher has a responsibility to set that little craft off on its own journey, and not to commandeer the journey, and not to be Miss Jean Brodie, you know, Miss Brodie's girls. Sorry, that's not what teachers are supposed to be doing. Teachers are a bit like parents, I think, in a way. That good enough is sometimes better than terrific. Sometimes people are very good at teaching something that they know a bit more about than the people they're teaching. One of the most beautiful sights I have ever seen in my life was seeing teaching of reading and writing, of literacy in Ethiopia, where the children who were taught for a year would turn round and teach the children who were beginning that year. And they rolled it on until you got right to the top, and there were grandmothers walking down the street with their little slates and their chalks because they couldn't afford books. That was a big luxury.
Teaching as a profession, those people who choose to have their jobs as teachers, how they earn their living, do you think, given the importance of learning, that we live in a society now where teachers get the respect they deserve? How do you see it? What progress have we made in, getting that message over clearly, how very, very important they are to our society?
there's a problem about teaching itself. If I say that anybody can do it, or must do it, or should do it, at whatever level, then it implies that school teachers are not special.
That's what worried me about one of the answers you gave earlier, that there needs to be a recognition, surely, of the very special skills that those who've trained to be teachers have. It is above and beyond what the rest of us who also teach have.
Well, I've thought a lot about this, and I always come down to the same answer. That you're not going to get the charismatic people you want or the innovators you want unless you place teachers higher in society. And in our society, there's only one way of doing that.
It's all about pay.
You have to pay them a whole lot more, not a percentage of a miserable wage each year, trying to keep up with, cost of living adjustments and so on. You need to actually say, right, the most glamorous jobs in England are as teachers in our schools. These are high-profile jobs, and you can earn as much as a teacher as you can on the floor of the stock exchange. That's the sort of thing I'm thinking. And that would solve a lot of our problems, because one of our discipline problems comes from the fact that the kids have no respect for the person whom they can see clearly is overworked and anxious. Why do kids burn down schools? Why have we got to have 8-foot walls around them? Is it because everybody loves them? No, it's because everybody hates them. Now, why? How have we done this? Every kid out there knows that you have to learn something every day, because their own culture changes all the time. They've got to be hip, they've got to be up to date. Yeah. And people who are supposed to be stupid can remember every move in a football game that happened 7 years ago. What enormous amount of intellectual energy goes into that? Why isn't it going into acquiring the skills that will make their own lives richer and more rewarding? What have we got wrong? And my answer would be everything, because we didn't put it. The school remains a ghetto on the outside of life. And the only way around that is to draw the school into the centre of the community, and not to close it down for 16 hours a day and all weekend and 12 weeks a year or whatever it is, but to make it a public resource so that everybody uses it. We all need to go to school all the time. It doesn't matter what our job is. We've got to retool, retrain all the time.
I used to teach in the inner city. When I was a teacher, I was in the inner city. And you're right, some kids did rebel against schools, and those are the ones we hear about. But my experience also is that for some kids, school was the only sane bit of their lives. And that for them, it's the only time they got any affection, they got any structure, they got anybody saying, you're good, you can make it, go for it. Families sometimes fail children as well. And at that point, schools and teachers can sometimes step in. So I wouldn't, I don't know whether you want to give the impression that, schools at the moment are institutions that fail loads and loads of kids. Because if you did, I might want to take a bit of exception to that.
Well, we hear all the time from industry that they're not getting the skills they need from school leavers and so on. And I do get a bit worried. I did get a bit worried with my students, some of whom just could not think clearly and couldn't express themselves properly at all. And I'm not sure if I would blame the school system particularly.
Schools don't exist as a separate part of society, do they, to some extent?
Except that I think they should be integrated much more than they are. And if they were to be open all the time, for example, if we'd actually be able to roll the equipment over faster, we'd actually have state-of-the-art equipment because it would be being properly used. We'd have our single mums that we worry about so much and tear our hair, coming when the babies are in bed and learning IT and new skills that they can deploy at home or wherever. And we'd have our poor old third agers, we'd be able to give them something to do.
We agree on that, so we've got a point there where we can agree. Let's move on, because I wanted to talk about your role, in terms of feminism, the 70s and the rest of it. Coincidentally, when the Female Eunuch was published and you were at Warwick, I was doing my teacher training at Coventry College, which is now part of the University of Warwick. I was there 70 to 74, so I do remember attending one of your lectures once, and it was a big thing. And I'm 50-odd now, and there's a lot of the teaching profession who are 50-odd-year-old women. And I think you gave us in the publication of that book and what you were saying and the stand you took, I think you gave a lot of us that were going into teaching at that time the confidence to try and make things different for the next generation of girls. What I've wanted to ask you for years is that what you were trying to do? And is that one of the things that you take some credit for and feel some pride about the effect you had on 20-odd-year-old women and what they then did in their own professional lives?
What made the difference was not the book, but the people who read the book. Because they made up for all the book's failings, whatever they were, because it chimed with something that was already happening. Exactly. Women were already sniffing the breeze. They were already saying, why am I not happier than that I'm supposed to have everything I want? Why do I feel dissatisfied? And here was an attempt to explain what's happened to you in the course of your domestication. They've turned you into this kind of a creature so that you're supposed to respond to other people's expectations. You're not supposed to have expectations of your own. Now, if the women took that idea and they made it work, I had no idea. The book ends with a question, what will you do? Well, they did things that to me are still amazing. I mean, how many women looked at their marriage and said, this could be better. This is degrading. I'm enduring conditions of existence that are humiliating, like condoning my husband's unfaithfulness and doing things, suffering all kinds of abuse, mostly psychological, for the sake of the children. I'm living under a rock. I'm getting out of here. And what happens when they do that? They face 16 years of living in poverty, of not being properly supported by the state or by the father of their children. And they've done it and done it and done it, and they don't stop doing it. And you think, a woman who can do that has got the courage to change everything. I'm just a writer.
But so much did change for women and for girls after that. I mean, lest anyone should think life's perfect, it's not, because girls in schools now have got different sorts of pressures. Life's different from them than it was for us when we were at schools. But looking at teenagers now in secondary schools, in urban areas or anywhere else, what are the pressures do you see on them now?
I'm very interested in the different behaviour of boys and girls in the classroom, because boys have a completely different agenda. Boys have got to impress their gang, their group. They have notions of prestige that derive entirely from the pecking order within their enclave that they've managed to set up. So when a boy asks a question, he asks it to impress the guys. I'm going to really floor her with this question, da-da-da. And they do it in a sort of histrionic way, and you wonder whether they really want the answer, or they probably already know it or don't care. Whereas when girls tend to sit in pairs and sort of huddle together, and then when they ask a question, it's because they really want the answer. So you've got two different styles. And people like to say that the girls are civilizing the boys, but I don't think that's what happens, frankly. It may happen with very adroit teachers who can balance this. Yeah. And I'm a bit concerned. The boys are now saying, oh, the subjects are all girly. They're all touchy-feely subjects, and we're not interested in them. And they're claiming, you know, that the exams are less competitive. I mean, I still have to endure the conundrum of watching University Challenge and watching the girls not answer a single question, because they're not competitive in the way that
competitiveness, not what they know. But
well, what it's got to do with is the fact you give a boy a challenge and he'll produce something. It might not be right, but it'll go ting and out it will come. You ask a girl a question, she thinks, oh, I think I know the answer. Oh, but perhaps I'm wrong.
It seems to me what you're saying, and when you talk to your fellow students, it's almost, I'm not sure you like this word, but it's the role model thing. It's leading by example. I mean, you might not like the word, but I can't think of a better one. Do girls need role models? And through role models, can we change those things about girls that perhaps might hold them back?
I really don't go for it, you know. I think much more important for young women and for people at school is the school subculture. And that's largely a matter of the peer group. So that, you know, if your peer group says, oh, you know, supermodels, blah. If it says, you know, the wags, the wives and girlfriends of the footballers, blah, that we're going to be different. And you can see it. I can see it all the time. I love it, the fact that some schools, the girls wear their skirts right down to the ground.
Yeah.
And other schools, the girls are wearing this little...
Very varied, yeah.
And you think, now, who's established this ethos, and where does it go? Because it's not cool to wear your learning on your sleeve. I used to say, you know, when we were trying to get young people to use condoms, that maybe we needed Boy George to come out on stage wearing nothing but a condom. Somehow we have to intersect with their culture. And I think one of the things maybe we have to do is get the real heroes of juvenile culture into the schools.
You've led me into the last question, really, because you started campaigning again. I hope you don't mind this word, but I think I've always thought of you a bit of an agitator, that, you know, the minute something you've campaigned for or agitated about is achieved, you move the argument on, you move the intellectual argument on. And I think that's sometimes painful for people who think they've achieved because they're being pushed on to more, but it's an incredibly necessary part of life. So I think my final question has to be, what are you agitating about now?
I want women's lives are hard, really, really hard, because they're nobler, they're better lives, they're more honest, they're fearless lives, but they're hard. And women are taking a lot of punishment, and there's a lot of resentment coming at them from men as well, which they've also got to deal with. It's cool when you're 25 and, you know, working as a stockbroker and think, you know, the sky's the limit. The sky's not the limit. Women are working so hard, 16 hours a day, and then feeling bad because they think they're letting their kids down and their bosses down and everybody else. Enough already, enough. You know, they're squeezing women all dry. Women have very little leisure. They have very little disposable income that they think they're entitled to spend on themselves once they pass the sort of highly employed, highly visible stage. And then, of course, when they get truly elderly, they're entirely surplus to requirements and can expect to be insulted and demeaned at every turn. People assume that they're stupid. They call them love and darling. Even me. They explain, you know, 2 and 2 are 4, dear. There's the work of women's liberation has not been done.
I think that's true. I think there's a generation that feel more positive about themselves, but I think that's absolutely true. I think what the answer to what you're agitating about is probably a new analysis of the state of women's lives at this present time. Germaine Greer, thank you very much for sharing it with us.
Thank you.